Many a radicalized resident has had his or her heckles heightened by this city's suspicious metabolism. Seattle, Washington, USA. The tragicomic utopia that subsumes criticisms beneath the veil of friendliness. Too secure for blame, too pleasant for condemnation. A demure secret kept in the northwest corner of the nation. A magnificent marketplace of gross goods, ample ambrosia, and transplanted tourists who could never quite quit the itch to throw bucks at the next thing moving. A boomtown without a glitch. Capitalism's never-never-land of mammon and lamb's milk. Rain-soaked metropolis of dense forestry but obscured roots. A figment of humanity's industrial revelation and a hub of hidden histories and unthreatened beauty to boot. Liberated or liberal, innocent and ignorance, free of blemish, the city of the spotless, a monument to politeness, fantasia of uncontestable niceness. The city in question is the subject of much mythologizing. Grand narratives that paint the Pacific Northwest's premier city in a pure light forget that Seattle is a byproduct of white Western frontierism, the optimism and opulence of the East bubbling over its borders and marching steadily from sea to shining sea.
Also, we think about the West in terms of the Western, the TV or the movie Western, and it's this realm of heroes and pioneers and kind of a mythic realm for us. It's very important to us in the realm of mythology, but that glosses over as much history as it conjures up.
Expansionists like Henry Yesler and Arthur Denny saw in Seattle a prime port for the international fur trade and a potential axis for the newly expanding railroad. Their Western design inevitably had to take into account Native Americans who, contrary to the myth of the contented noble savage, were as excited at the prospect of material gain as the white settlers. The original name for the soon-to-be city in the 1850s was DeWamps, until white settlers agreed on the name Seattle, after the chief of the indigenous Duwamish tribe.
Native people are interested in good relations with other people who seem to have access to wealth and who seem to have certain desirable abilities or powers. So they cultivate relations, at least the upper class Native people do, with some of these settlers and fur traders. They invite marriage with their daughters, and there is quite a bit of intermarriage.
Scholar Richard Drinan once wrote of the metaphysics of Indian hating, the idea that all of America's domestic and international race and class dynamics can be traced back to the country's initial interactions with Native Americans. Indeed, in Seattle, race relations with indigenous people would sour as more and more white settlers migrated to the burgeoning city. Rich and poor white migrants traveled to Seattle in the 1880s and 90s on railroads built by Chinese contract labor, with many native tribes gradually relegated to a system of reservations and Chinese Americans expelled due to competition over jobs. White Seattle was left to its own internal devices. A new class hierarchy was taking shape in Seattle's residential patterns, and it reflected the spirit of segregation first revealed in white Seattle's contacts with Native and Chinese Americans.
After coming to Seattle and settling down, I became convinced that Green Lake had all those characteristics necessary to the making of a beautiful and restful home. It was here that we bought a house in 1891, expecting to live out the remainder of our days. Green Lake News, November 26, 1903.
We submit to our readers some description of the plague spots of Seattle. No self-respecting citizen would tolerate an open filth hole in his own dwelling, but that is what Seattle is doing. Most of our people forget what is waiting around the corner. The Seattle Post-Intelligencer, June 10th, 1900.
But most of them lived downtown in the Pioneer Square areas where most everyone lived. who was here at the time, the immigrant population, the white population, the black population, the Chinese, they were all down in what we think of as the Pioneer Square area at first.
Shortly after the turn of the century, white Seattleites with enough money lived eagerly in anticipation of moving to outlying neighborhoods like Queen Anne, Wallingford, even as far north as Shoreline. It was all very fitting. The city that was founded in the 1850s as a project of well-to-do frontiersmen was, 50 years later, composed of suburban frontiers inhabited by well-to-do Seattleites. Seattle entered the 20th century as a primarily white city with a progressively middle-class character and an ambivalent, if not hostile, relationship to its small communities of color. Take an afternoon out of your day and scan the microfilm of Seattle's newspapers from the 19-teens and roaring 20s. The city was obsessed with outward expansion. The racial divisions originally reserved for Native and Chinese Americans were manifested in the form of the infamous restricted housing covenants.
Our best evidence for Seattle is that these covenants began to emerge around the second decade of the 20th century. That is, that there were neighborhoods that were being established, and as those neighborhoods were established, restrictions would be placed in the deeds, the property, and those restrictions would cover a whole host of things, but they would just as likely cover, and more likely cover, race as not. And so we see them creeping in the 1920s increasingly, and by the 1930s they cover most of Seattle. But I think you could probably make the argument that across America they cover most of the major urban locales.
It's been said many times and in many ways that the merry story of the revolution against racism in the Jim Crow South represents the nation's paramount victory against the problem of the color line. Black, white, brown, red, and yellow Americans are attracted to the black and white simplicity of the South's clear-cut successions from slavery to Jim Crow to nonviolent success. Northern liberals have always been quick to point out the splinters in the eyes of others while being indecisive about the planks in their own, and a far harder task to tackle has been the almost imperceptible overlap between race and class, between the largely light-skinned haves and the primarily dark-skinned have-nots in any of the stars of capitalism's constellation of major cities. On car drives and bus rides through Seattle's pleasant present-day neighborhoods, those with the patient's eye and ear for history hear and see the shameful residue of an unresolved past. In the language of racial and financial aristocrats, Seattleites in the mid-20th century excluded hogs and dogs from their property in the same breath as they excluded Negroes and Chinamen. behold the world and the words left to us by yesteryear.
Queen Anne, the blue blood in Seattle's veins, where aristocracy is real, not codfish. Webster gives 11 definitions of nice, and none of them are right because none of them mention Queen Anne. Horrid people never climbed this hill. Though unwealthy people might live here, you will never find any jazzy boozies in Queen Anne. Seattle Post-Intelligencer, October 31st, 1927.
Segregation in Seattle was a privatized endeavor, and challenging corporate injustice proved a battle between the citizen and the state, and private interests that led to very public inequities. When in 1964 a mostly white demographic voted down an open housing ordinance by a 2-to-1 margin, one black community figure declared, "If we could get a white majority to support desegregation, we wouldn't have needed an ordinance in the first place." The next 3 years saw an inspired conglomeration of blacks, Asian Americans, and Jews declare war with waves of sit-ins, picket lines, and protests, aimed largely at the obstinate Seattle Real Estate Board. Their most effective, if unlikely alliances came from outspoken whites like university professors Roger Sale and Sheila Bottomer, and even from a few liberal real estate agencies. In April of 1968, possibly in fear of the race riots that torched other major cities after Dr. King's assassination, the City Council unanimously adopted an open housing measure. And by 1980, the majority of Seattle's black population no longer lived in the Central District. The legacies of ethnic displacement and residential segregation that white Seattle shares with most advanced industrial hubs might lead to depression beyond redemption for dissidents of the present day, if it weren't for the proud histories of contentious politics that the city also lays claim to. History indicts and also potentially redeems the city in question.